So today I want to follow up on the whole Jordan Neely situation. Jordan Neely was a homeless man that was killed by a vigilante by a chokehold on the New York City subway. At this point, maybe a week and a half ago, and just thinking more and more about it, right? There are certain conclusions that I feel like I have to come to. They're becoming more and more obvious when you look at the discussion of all of this online and elsewhere. So first of all, you just have to conclude that conservatives have absolutely no sense of and no desire for any kind of community, right? Which is kind of, it should be surprising to a lot of people, simply because when you think of like right-wing, left-wing psychology going back many centuries, millennia, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, right, back to, you know, the kind of like first era when we were recognizably human, you would expect that conservative psychology would dictate that community matters, that if you are, for instance, in new spaces around people that you don't really know, that you don't recognize, you're going to have to change your behavior, you're going to have to adapt, you're going to have to take, let's just call it, personal responsibility. But especially in the last few decades, a lot of that has totally gone out the window when it comes to both left-wing and right-wing psychology. When it comes to right-wing psychology right now, we've reached a stage where things that you would expect to be kind of like principles, I guess, of conservatism, they're just not those principles anymore, right? Basic things like we have finite resources, we have environmental degradation of the planet. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a conservative, and so was Nixon. And both presidents introduced quite a bit when it comes to environmental legislation, right? Much more, for instance, than Bill Clinton, right, who sort of wrecked the environment, which is why Ralph Nader decided to run. Obama didn't do much, and in fact sort of took that backwards. But in sort of like less predictable ways, you start seeing these fractures and fault lines elsewhere. And reading the responses from conservatives to the Jordan Neely killing, you're just going to have to conclude that everything that they say about small communities coming together, adapting, understanding culture, understanding where you stand in relation to, you know, essentially everybody else, right? These things are supposed to be long-term projects and beliefs and values of right-wingers. It's just not the case anymore, is it? And the reason why I say that specifically in this situation is, just look at, just type in Jordan Neely, right, on Twitter, and look at the more conservative responses. It's full of people that are, on the one hand, absolutely fearful of anything outside of their own zone of understanding, right, their own, just kind of like what they're used to. They have all these fantasies about, you know, what I would have to deal with, right? How I would respond to a situation like a homeless man going crazy in a subway. How would I respond? How would I feel? Would I be able to rise to, in their minds, right? It's rising to the occasion for self-defense, but really it's rising to the occasion of murder because you feel uncomfortable, because you feel fearful. And they, at no point do they ever assume that they have to change anything about themselves. If you look at, for instance, what liberal women feel, or liberal men feel, or conservative men and women feel as they're like walking through a neighborhood, for instance, there's always this idea that I need to be catered to, right? I need to be helped in some way. I need to be secured, not just by state agencies and state forces around me, such as cops or whatever. I need to be taken care of even by random people in this neighborhood, in this place, right? I shouldn't have to be aware necessarily of my surroundings. they don't say that quite explicitly because it sounds ridiculous, but we get kind of close, right? We get pretty close to that area. And the same thing is very obviously happening now on the conservative side with this killing. Again, it's a bunch of men usually that are watching this, and they're wondering, all right, I have never had to really have my masculinity questioned. I never really had to think about or deal with what it really means to be a man in some of these more dangerous situations. How would I react, right? And they always have these murder fantasies because they're fearful. When people like Richard Hanania, or Hanania, not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, when people like that start their commentaries on violent crime, violent street crime in bad neighborhoods, there's the same kind of implicit assumption that wherever that I might choose to go, whether it's if I move to a totally new neighborhood in New York City, or if I decide to move to Kingston, Jamaica, or if I decide to go, I don't know, somewhere in South America, somewhere in Africa, maybe some of the more dangerous cities in Asia, some of the more dangerous cities in Russia, because again, this is not, people have really racialized crime over the last century, and especially the last few decades. But if you look at the crime rates in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, where there was a total breakdown of the state, right, social services, all that, we had crime that was just substantially higher than even the peaks that you could find in a place like America. America obviously is out of the norm when it comes to crime, when it comes to violent crime, and also, crime, white-collar crime. We're out of the norm in many, many respects. When you look at Russia in the same time period, there's regions in like 1995, like Tuva, for instance, where, like if you look at, for instance, the murder rate in New Orleans, you could double that or you could triple that, and you would still not get at the worst of the day-to-day living and interactions that you might have in some of the kind of like shittier cities in Tuva or whatever, right? So this is not just like a racial thing, but it stands to reason that anywhere that you go, people are not going to be catering to you. You're going to have to be aware, right? You're going to have to find a way to fit in. You're going to have to understand the situation that you're in. And you can't expect anyone else to secure your own safety. I mean, to some degree, right? You should be able to rely on the police force and stuff like that. But, the police is not going to be around you 24/7, right? You don't get any kind of escorts. You're actually going to have to deal with what it means to be someone that feels a little bit out of place. And the Marine that killed Jordan Neely, he felt out of place, right? You could sort of tell that he hasn't really dealt with something like that before. In his statement, he was saying how scared he felt. I mean, let's take that at face value, right? I think it's total bullshit, but let's just assume that that's correct. If he in fact felt so scared to the point where he needed to choke someone to death for 15 minutes, despite being substantially larger and despite having help from other grown men around him, if that's in fact how you feel, that means that you don't have actually a very good probabilistic set of judgments when it comes to your own safety, when it comes to crime, when it comes to really anything at all that you should be aware of, that you should be thinking about. Because if he had, tons of experience, let's say, with homeless people in the subways or whatever, he probably would not react in that way, because it's like, all right, I've seen this a million times before. And it's just so sickening to hear everything that is said about liberal entitlement and all that. I mean, obviously it exists, but conservative entitlement is absolutely I'm going to go essentially slumming it anywhere that I feel like. And if you scare me in any way, if you make me feel uncomfortable in any way, I'm going to essentially kill you, right? If that's where we are, that's where we are, right? And it totally disrupts what it means to be part of a community, right? If you are fearful to be in a neighborhood where you don't look like anybody else, you have not properly integrated yourself, right? And that's another funny thing, right? They constantly talk about integration. Usually it's about Muslims or whatever, but actual integration in a real community where you get to know people, you become a fixture, that is obviously important if you're going to live anywhere. And there's absolutely no sense in their minds that they have to do any of that at all. There's no legwork, there's no necessity, there are no obligations. The only obligations that exist are the obligations that are made towards you, right? Everybody has all these obligations that they need to meet towards you, but you have no obligations whatsoever, right? And that's a kind of crazy, it's like a parasitic relationship, right, on the meaning of the word community, right? It's total parasitism on the concept, right? And you're like just always read between the lines when you see commentary specifically on street crime, because again, that's another big thing. That's another dimension to all this, because everyone seems to be concerned about street crime, despite the fact that even if literally all the homicides that we have every year, between 20 to 25,000, even if literally all of them are murders, meaning unjustified homicides, then isn't that like, oh sorry, isn't that like a drop in the bucket, right, compared to pollution, the fact that we don't have universal health care? I mean, how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, illegal wars, right? This is really where true crime resides, right? It resides in stagnation. Remember that video that I put up translating Edward Limonov's comments on basically the breakup of the USSR, right? He said that when we think about crime, right, he's talking about historically about the USSR, he said perestroika, right, that's a crime. The era of stagnation, that's a crime, right? That leads to deaths, right? It's this kind of slow accretion, the slow kind of strangulation of a community. And it's written in such a way where those things are never considered crimes, because if you consider anything like that a crime, suddenly you have to go after the authors of the laws. You have to go after the people in charge. You would have to, for instance, prosecute Donald Trump for killing 500,000 Americans by not taking COVID seriously. Yeah, but look, read between the lines, start to really understand when people are discussing, the facts of the matter when it comes to crime or anything else, or are they just discussing their fears, right? Are they just so hyper fixated on their fears and the fear that, well, you know what? Not everybody's actually going to meet these so-called obligations to me, right? I need to carry out obligations towards others as well. And honestly, I think a huge aspect to Jordan Neely is exactly that. It's this total inability to square those differences and to consider these realities. I mean, I don't even have anything else to say other than that. Conservatives are absolutely walling out right now. It's not, and that's the thing, it's not conservatism anymore, is it? Right? We're not talking about conservatism anymore. This is now, it's just like radical right-wingism that has no basis in these psychological fractures, right, that we've had, not only in human beings, right, but this is probably present in animals as well, right? If and that's the thing, it makes, there's nothing essentially wrong with being psychologically conservative or liberal, because conservatism, it's like, okay, how open or not open are you to new experiences? How fearful or not fearful are you when it comes to various stimuli? And when you look at these studies, right, right-wingers are the most fearful. This is why there's this hyperfixation on guns. There's this hyperfixation on self-defense. There's this fixation on we need to neutralize every threat, even if a so-called threat is not a threat at all, right? You cannot brook, and it kind of makes sense, right? If conservatism is sort of meant to keep the species from doing something totally wild, right, doing something totally insane, and therefore ending the species as a whole, you can imagine plenty of situations where this becomes just absolutely regressive, right? And threats that are not really threats are now hyperinflated to become threats. All of that is happening now. We're watching it. Look at the studies related to fearfulness when it comes to liberal versus conservative psychology. It's really fascinating to think what has been happening historically, but you know, especially accelerating in the last few decades. So read between the lines, guys. I'm coming with a video with Laura Woods. We're going to do a poetry workshop actually in a couple of days, and that should be up next week. So looking forward to that. We'll see you later.